Hello, I'm Desire500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Well, today's the 1st of October, but it's also Jimmy Carter's birthday. And I have a list of facts here, so I'm going to read one of them here, and that would be that Jimmy Carter had the longest post-presidency of almost 44 years. Had he lived an extra month, it would have been 44 years. And that's actually longer. His post-presidency was longer than the time spent from Theodore Roosevelt's birth to the moment he ascended to President of the United States. That's crazy. Hello, I'm Desire500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Well, the 9th President of the United States, William Henry Harrison, didn't actually spend very much time as president at all, 31 days. And back in those days, as pretty much as it is still now, is in the early days of the presidency, really, all you're doing is giving out jobs to people who want jobs. And William Henry Harrison, well, you're supposed to do that before you take office, but William Henry Harrison didn't do that. And his White House, under him in the first month of his presidency, well, the only month of his presidency, was crowded. In fact, it was so crowded that in order to go from room to room in his own house, he had to leave through the window of one room and enter through the window of the next. Hello, I'm Desire500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. When it comes to liking music, pretty much all of the presidents did. I mean, most humans do like music. However, the 18th president, Ulysses S. Grant, was tone deaf, so he could understand music that well. He said that he only understood 2 tunes. One of them was Yankee Doodle, the other one wasn't. Hello, I'm Desire500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. I was reading some of Calvin Coolidge's autobiography today, and that's how I figured out that today actually is the anniversary of his wedding to his wife, Grace. And I thought it'd be very interesting to go over a couple of stories from Calvin Coolidge's dates with Grace. Before they got married, Calvin Coolidge was listening to a speech made by the Committee of the Daughters of the American Revolution, where he accidentally sat in the governor's seat. He was then asked to relinquish the seat, which of course he did. However, he came back as the governor and sat down in the governor's seat and remarked to his then wife, "Now they can't tell us to get out of the governor's seats." Hello, I'm Desire500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Well, I'm just walking back from church now, and my priest used the word normalcy in his homily. And if I wasn't very astute in history, I probably would have thought nothing of it. But since I am, I think I should tell you that the word normalcy was invented, not created. It was, well, I mean, it was the same thing. It was invented by a president. It was invented by President Warren G. Harding in the 1920 election campaign. He promised a return to normalcy after World War I. Hello, I'm Desire500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. On August 2nd, 1923, President Warren G. Harding passed away from a heart attack in California. So that means his vice president becomes the president. Calvin Coolidge was not in D.C. on August 2nd, 1923. He was at home in Vermont visiting his father, when he was awoken at 3 o'clock in the morning the next day, when he received the news that he was, in fact, President of the United States. Hello, I'm Desire500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Well, I've recently been reading Calvin Coolidge's autobiography, and I'm actually almost done. I think I've got about 20 more pages until I am finished, but I was reading something yesterday that really made me a little bit sad. And that was when Calvin Coolidge described the loss of his son, Calvin Coolidge Jr. He said, when he passed, the power and the glory of the presidency passed with him. Hello, I'm Desire500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. The 9th President of the United States, William Henry Harrison, didn't do much, but he is notable for being the first president from the Whig Party. The Whig Party was created to oppose Andrew Jackson, and they pledged to only serve 1 term. And it was started by Henry Clay. And when Henry Clay lost the first election of the Whig Party back in 1836, William Henry Harrison won in 1840, of course. Well, sorry, Clay lost it in 1832, Harrison lost in 36, but then Harrison came back and won in 1840. Henry Clay loved that. He thought that Harrison, not knowing what he was doing because he was more of a military guy, that Henry Clay would effectively run the country. However, Harrison denied one of Clay's appointees to a position, saying, "Mr. Clay, I think you have forgotten that I am the president." Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Today, in the year 2025, we look at the 33rd president, Harry S. Truman, as very positive. We view him as a good person. However, he grew up in Missouri, and just 20 years before he was born, Missouri had allowed slavery. So he grew up in a really, really racist town. And oftentimes, he even admitted himself. He found himself saying the N-word when he was alone. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. We often associate American secession with Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War because why wouldn't we? He had a literal civil war. But during the War of 1812, 4th President James Madison was very, very close to dealing with his own secession crisis because the northern states, loyal to Britain, whom the Americans were fighting, threatened to secede from the Union if the war didn't stop. Overall, they didn't secede, but they could have. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. In American history, we celebrate Abraham Lincoln as the liberator of the slaves, and that is 100% true. However, another person who would like to claim himself as the liberator of the slaves, Karl Marx, liked Abraham Lincoln for liberating the slaves. In fact, Karl Marx had written Abraham Lincoln a telegraph congratulating him on his victory in the 1864 presidential election. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Today is the 12th of October, and while you might not think that's a special day, Theodore Roosevelt definitely would. On this day in history, in 1901, the 26th President of the United States used an executive order to rename the Executive Mansion the White House because the house was white. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Right now, I'm in the easternmost part of Canada in Newfoundland and Labrador. And I think it's very interesting to talk about the birthplace of United States presidents because it's very obvious to see how important the East was, which of course the East was the start of the country, and how little importance the West is. Richard Nixon is the westernmost born president, being born in California. Next up would be Gerald Ford, born in Nebraska. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Well, actually, it's more of a failed presidential candidate fact of the day. But I'd like to remind you that the 1928 election loser, Al Smith, who lost to Herbert Hoover, was actually a pretty important guy outside of politics. Not only was he the first Roman Catholic to ever be nominated as a major candidate for president, he was also the designer for the Empire State Building. In fact, another one of the designers is actually from my home country of Canada. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Well, back in 2009, the President of the United States, Barack Obama, came here, well, not exactly here, but he came to Canada, he came to Ottawa. And he was actually the very first United States president to ever eat a Canadian pastry called beaver tail. And if you've ever had a beaver tail, you would agree with him when he said it was very, very delicious. Further note, he also didn't want to leave Ottawa, which, I mean, why would you want to leave Canada and go to the States? Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Well, yesterday I talked about how President Obama ate a Canadian dish called beaver tail back in 2009. But I actually forgot to mention that while Obama was here, we actually renamed beaver tail to Obama tail to honor his visit. I was not alive in 2009, so of course I don't remember that. But I really wish I was, because I think it's going to be quite a long time until a traditional Canadian dish is named after an American. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. 25th President of the United States, William McKinley, wore this little scarlet coronation everywhere he went. It was like his lucky charm, I guess you could say. But well, I mean, it clearly worked because he became president of the United States, so it worked. But he decided to give it away on the 6th of September, 1901, to a little girl at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. He was shot that day and died the next week. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. The United States Senate used the exact same gavel all the way from the creation of the Senate in 1789 to 1954. Now, what happened in 1954? Well, the Vice President of the United States, Richard Nixon, who would go on to serve as president, and that's why I'm talking about it, actually broke the gavel in a heated debate about nuclear energy. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. The 30th President of the United States, Calvin Coolidge, was kind of a jokester. He would often press the button on his desk that would get a couple of his bodyguards coming. It's kind of like an emergency button, like, oh, someone's in here, you gotta come save me. He would often press that button just for fun. Hide under the desk. He would hide under the desk so that when the people came, they were like, whoa, where's the president? He found it very funny. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. When the second president of the United States, John Adams, left for England with the third president of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, way before either of them were president, they went to England, and more specifically, Stratford-upon-Avon. And if you know Stratford-upon-Avon, you know that that was the hometown of William Shakespeare himself. So of course, what else are you gonna do in Stratford-upon-Avon? John Adams and Thomas Jefferson went to the house of William Shakespeare and actually chipped off a part of his chair and brought it back to the colonies. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. It was actually more of a vice presidential fact of the day because I thought it'd be very interesting to mention John Calhoun, who was vice president of the United States in the 1820s and 1830s. He served from 1825 until 1832. He was the only, well actually not, that's not true, first of two vice presidents to resign, and he was the first because of a scandal that broke under his second president. That's right, he served under two presidents, John Quincy Adams from 1825 to 1829, and Andrew Jackson from 1829 to 1832. He was under Adams, but after, falling out of favor with Adams, he left Adams and ran with Jackson against Adams, and then fell out of favor with Jackson. So I don't think I would be friends with him. He seems to be the problem. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Yesterday I talked about how John Calhoun served under two different presidents, but he wasn't the first, and of course not the only. George Clinton served under two different presidents as Vice President of the United States. That'd be under Thomas Jefferson's second term and James Madison's first term. But Clinton would die in 1812, so he wouldn't serve out his full term. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Yesterday, I talked about a certain George Clinton who served as Vice President under two different presidents. However, something very interesting with George Clinton is his surname, Clinton, which is also the surname of the 42nd President of the United States, Bill Clinton. However, before you start getting any ideas, they were very likely not related. In fact, it's more than likely by blood that they were not related, as Bill Clinton's birth name was not Bill Clinton, it was William Jefferson Blythe III. Clinton was the name of his stepfather. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Well, today, my Toronto Blue Jays play in the World Series for the first time in 32 years. So I thought it'd be pretty interesting to mention a baseball fact for today, and that is on April 14th, 1910, President William Howard Taft threw the very first presidential first pitch of the baseball season to the Seattle team of that time. What a very interesting fact, and let's go Blue Jays. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. The 39th President of the United States, Jimmy Carter, was born on the 1st of October 1924. in a hospital. And I'm emphasizing that because he was the very first president to be born in a hospital, which may sound surprising from a modern lens, but back in the 19th and early 20th century, hospitals weren't really a thing. They only really started to become more popular around the time Jimmy Carter was born in 1924. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. There have been 47 different presidents of the United States, all of whom celebrated July 4th as the Independence Day. But that's actually not true what I just said, because only 46 of them did. The second president of the United States, John Adams, did not celebrate the 4th of July as Independence Day, because he believed that the date when the Continental Congress agreed to have an independent nation, should be the day that people celebrated as Independence Day, not July 4th, the date that the Declaration of Independence was worded. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. The 13th president of the United States, Millard Fillmore, was the very first president to establish a library at the White House. This was mostly because of his wife, who was a teacher, and of course, loved reading. So it took until the 1850s for the White House to have a public library. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. I think it goes without saying that you probably know that in the old world, they are obsessed with building tombs and mausoleums for their leaders. But here in the new world, it's not really the same. As a Canadian, our biggest tomb is probably, I don't know, somewhere here in Toronto. But in America, the largest mausoleum in all of North America belongs to the 18th president, Ulysses Grant, who was not just the 18th president. And if you asked him and called him only the 18th president, he probably would get a little bit mad because he did a little bit more than just 18th president. And the Americans loved him for that. Honestly, if you went to America and didn't like Grant, you'd probably go to jail for treason. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. The very first president to complete a marathon was George W. Bush, the 43rd president of the United States. And he did this in 1993, completing the Houston Marathon in about 3 hours, 45 minutes. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. So many US presidents have died in Washington, D.C., whether as president or not. But the first to die in Washington, not as president, was John Quincy Adams, who had been president, but died literally in the Capitol building on the 23rd of February, 1848. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. It really is. Well, today it is Halloween, and I am dressed up as Donald J. Trump, President of the United States. 3 American presidents have been impeached in American history, and Donald Trump has been impeached twice. That's a record, baby. 2 times. No other American president's coming close to that.